There are moments that divide life into before and after. For John Miller, that moment occurred on an otherwise ordinary Sunday morning, when fate decided to prove that even the most meticulous plans could be rewritten in mere seconds. The clock read exactly 8:47 a.m. when John pushed open the door to the small bakery in the residential neighborhood. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and warm croissants should have been comforting, but something felt off. The air seemed heavier, as if the universe itself were holding its breath, preparing for an extraordinary event. John had no idea that the next few minutes would irreversibly transform his perfectly organized existence. At 36, John Miller was the living embodiment of corporate success. As the CEO of one of the largest financial consulting firms on the East Coast, his name was whispered with reverence in the halls of Wall Street. His corner office atop the most prestigious building in the financial district offered a panoramic view of the city, a constant reminder of the empire he had built through relentless determination and calculated sacrifices. That morning, however, something had pulled him out of his meticulously planned Sunday routine. The silence of his penthouse apartment, usually a sanctuary of tranquility, felt suffocating. The stark white walls and minimalist decor, carefully curated by a renowned interior designer, suddenly seemed to scream a truth he had been ignoring. His life was as antiseptically perfect as it was empty. Then she walked in. Evelyn Davis wasn't the kind of woman who would typically catch John's attention. Her naturally wavy brown hair escaped a casual bun, and her simple summer dress stood in stark contrast to the impeccably polished women who frequented his social circles. But it wasn't Evelyn who made John's blood freeze, it was the four boys accompanying her. Time seemed to slow as his eyes scanned each of the boys. Something about them disturbed him deeply. The way they moved, the shape of their faces, even the way one of them furrowed his brow while studying the menu, it all felt unnervingly familiar, like looking at photographs of his own childhood multiplied by 4. The boys, all around 8 years old, moved through the space like small whirlwinds of energy. Nathan, watch out for the lady. Lucas, stop running. Oliver, let your brother choose first. Ethan, please sit down. Evelyn's voice carried a melody of familiarity, balancing maternal authority with an infinite patience John had never witnessed before. He tried to focus on his coffee, but his eyes were irresistibly drawn to the unfolding scene. Every movement, every gesture of the boys seemed like a page ripped from the memories of his own childhood. The way Nathan bit his lower lip in concentration, a habit his own mother used to call his trademark. Oliver's determined stance as he defended his choice of cake flavor. Ethan's shy smile as he thanked the waitress. The way Lucas pushed his hair back, exactly as John used to do in old photos his mother kept. Fate, however, had chosen its moment with surgical precision. Lucas, the most restless of the four, abruptly stood up to reach for the salt shaker, knocking over his glass of juice. The orange liquid snaked across the table, creating a small stream that threatened John's Italian leather shoes. "I'm sorry, sir." The boy's voice wavered slightly, his wide eyes, so familiar, filled with worry. John was already rising to help when it happened. As Lucas turned his head to clean up the spill, there it was, a small birthmark just behind his right ear. A half-moon shape, identical to the one John carried in the exact same spot, a feature his mother had always said was as unique as a fingerprint. The world seemed to freeze. Conversations around him blurred into a distant hum. A long-buried memory surged back with the force of a tsunami. A fertility clinic, a donation form, a decision made nearly a decade ago to help cover the costs of graduate school. A choice that had seemed so insignificant at the time. Evelyn must have noticed something in his expression because her face shifted subtly. Her eyes met John's, and in that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. She knew. Somehow she had always known. "I'm Evelyn," she said, her calm voice masking a storm of emotions. "And these are Nathan, Lucas, Oliver, and Ethan." "John Miller," he replied automatically, his own voice sounding strange to his ears. His gaze remained fixed on Lucas's birthmark, that small crescent-shaped mark that had just turned his world upside down. The silence that followed was deafening, filled only with the distant sounds of the bakery and the cheerful voices of the boys, oblivious to the seismic moment unfolding before them. John realized he was trembling slightly, his hands gripping the now-cold coffee cup far too tightly. "Maybe we should talk," Evelyn finally suggested, her voice low and controlled. "The boys have swimming lessons in half an hour, but we could meet later?" John nodded mechanically, unable to form coherent words. His carefully constructed world, each brick laid with calculated precision over the years, was crumbling before his eyes. As he watched Evelyn organize the boys to leave, Thousands of small details that he hadn't noticed at first began to stand out. The way Nathan furrowed his brow when he was concentrating, Oliver's contagious laughter, the thoughtful way Ethan observed everything around him. They exchanged phone numbers in a silence heavy with meaning. John watched the little family leave the bakery, his heart pounding to an unfamiliar rhythm. In a matter of minutes, his meticulously planned Sunday had turned into the day that would divide his life into two distinct parts. Before and after that moment in the bakery. The implications began to form in his mind like pieces of a surreal puzzle. He was no longer just John Miller, the relentless CEO focused on professional achievements. He was potentially a father. A father of 4 boys whom, until just hours ago, he hadn't even known existed. The rest of the day dragged on like a fever dream. John wandered aimlessly through the city, his steps automatically taking him to familiar places, but his mind remained fixed on the 4 little versions of himself he had encountered. Every memory of his own childhood now carried a new perspective, and he found himself imagining all the moments he had missed. First steps, first words, first days of school. That night, in his luxurious and eerily silent apartment, John stared out at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The lights of the buildings flickered like distant stars, reminding him of just how much his life had changed in a single day. His phone buzzed with a message from Evelyn, confirming a meeting for the next day at a cafe near her office. For the first time in his adult life, John Miller, the man who always had a plan for everything, was completely lost. There was no instruction manual for this situation, no precedent in his vast corporate experience to guide him. It was uncharted territory, frightening and paradoxically, the first moment in years when he felt truly alive. As he prepared for what would surely be a sleepless night, John realized he was about to embark on the most important journey of his life. A journey for which no MBA or experience in mergers and acquisitions could have prepared him. The challenge ahead was no longer about maximizing profits or closing deals but about human connections and possibilities of love he had never considered. The question was no longer whether he wanted to be part of those children's lives but how he could do so in a way that honored both the family Evelyn had built and the newly discovered biological ties. For the first time in his life, John Miller was completely out of control, and strangely, it didn't scare him as much as it should have. The cafe Evelyn had chosen was discreet and cozy, very different from the sophisticated venues John frequented for his business lunches. Seated at a table in the most private corner, he nervously adjusted the cuff of his dress shirt, a habit he had developed over the years to cope with stressful situations. Today, however, none of his usual coping mechanisms seemed to work. Evelyn arrived promptly at 2 p.m., dressed in a simple professional ensemble that suggested she had come straight from work. Her hair was styled into a neater bun than the day before, but her eyes carried the same determined glimmer that had captured John's attention. "Thank you for coming," she began, sitting down with a composed grace. "I imagine you have a lot of questions." John took a deep breath, trying to organize the whirlwind of thoughts that had tormented him throughout the sleepless night. How did you know?" was all he could manage to say. Evelyn gave a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "The fertility clinic had your detailed profile. Doctor, 27 years old, brown eyes, 1.85 meters tall, distinctive birthmark behind your right ear. When the boys were born with the same mark, I knew it wasn't a coincidence." She paused, taking a sip of the coffee that had just been served. But it wasn't just that. As they grew, every little mannerism, every tiny detail. It was like watching a movie on 4 different screens, each showing a slightly different variation of the same person. John felt his throat tighten. "Why didn't you look for me before?" Evelyn's face softened with a mixture of complex emotions. "It wasn't that simple, John. When I found out I was pregnant with quadruplets, my whole life changed in an instant. I was 28, had a promising career as a university professor, and suddenly, I was about to become a mother of 4 babies." She paused, her fingers absently playing with the edge of her cup. "The doctors suggested selective reduction, saying it would be safer. But I couldn't. I already loved them, all of them. So, I decided I would make it work, somehow." John felt his heart tighten. The idea that his genes had created 4 lives, and that Evelyn had faced it all alone, hit him like a punch to the stomach. It must have been incredibly hard. "It was quite the challenge," she smiled, this time with more warmth. "My parents supported me a lot at the beginning. I moved closer to them, cut back my hours at the university, and slowly we started building our routine. The boys have always been very close, which helped immensely. They take care of each other in a way that moves me every day." "And what about the donor? What about me?" John asked, his voice soft. "You never considered looking for me?" Evelyn looked him directly in the eyes. I thought about it many times, especially when the boys started asking about their father. But you made an anonymous donation, John. Legally, you had no obligation to us. And more than that, she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I didn't want to complicate the life we had built unless it was absolutely necessary. John nodded slowly, processing each word. And now, what's changed? Fate decided for us, didn't it? Evelyn gave a small smile. When I saw you yesterday at the bakery watching the boys with that look of recognition, I knew I couldn't keep this distance any longer. The silence that followed was filled with the soft hum of the coffee shop and the weight of unspoken possibilities. John found himself thinking about the last 8 years of his life. The endless meetings, the lonely nights in his office, the professional achievements that seemed emptier and emptier. All this time there had been 4 little versions of him growing, learning, living. The boys? He began hesitating. What are they like? Evelyn's face lit up instantly, as it always did when she spoke about her children. Nathan is the natural leader, always taking care of his brothers. Lucas is our artist, always drawing or creating something new. Oliver is the scientist, fascinated by how things work. And Ethan? She smiled warmly. Ethan is our little philosopher, always asking questions that leave me speechless. Each description was like a small stab to John's heart, painful but somehow precious. They were parts of him, reflected and transformed into something new and wonderful. Do they know about the donation? He asked, his voice trembling. They know they don't have a traditional father, that they came from a special donation that allowed me to have them, Evelyn explained. They're smart kids, John. They understand more than we think. John leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. Evelyn, I know this is completely unexpected and that you've built a wonderful life with them, but I'd like to meet them. Not to interfere or complicate things, but just to be present in some way. Evelyn's eyes filled with unshed tears. I knew you'd say that, she whispered. You have the same determined look I see in Nathan when he decides something. How do we do this? John asked, his tone a mix of anxiety and hope. How can we make this work without hurting anyone? Evelyn took a deep breath, carefully considering her response. We need to take it slow, John. The boys are sensitive, and any big change in their lives needs to be introduced very carefully. Of course, John agreed quickly, leaning forward. You know the boys better than anyone. How do you suggest we start? First, we need to build a convincing story about how we met, Evelyn explained, her practical side coming through. The kids can't know about the donation right away. It would be too confusing for them at this point. John nodded, admiring the way she protected her children. We could say we met through mutual friends? That could work, she agreed. You could start by coming to a few casual events, maybe one of their baseball games next weekend? Nathan and Lucas play on the school team. John's face lit up with the possibility. They play baseball? I played too when I was their age. Another thing they inherited from you? Evelyn smiled gently. Oliver and Ethan prefer chess and robotics, but they go to every game to cheer on their brothers. John felt his heart race with each new detail about the boys. It was like discovering pieces of himself scattered across 4 distinct and unique personalities. I have one condition, Evelyn said suddenly, her tone growing more serious. If you decide to be part of their lives, it can't be temporary. They've already experienced enough loss in their young lives. My father passed away 2 years ago, and they still miss him terribly. The gravity of the situation hit John like a ton of bricks. This wasn't like a business contract that could be cancelled with a well-written clause. There were 4 young, vulnerable hearts at stake. Evelyn, he began, his voice heavy with contained emotion. I know my life up until now has been focused on business and professional success. But since yesterday, since the moment I saw those boys, something changed in me. I can't explain it, but I feel a connection, a responsibility. It's not just DNA or moral obligation. It's something deeper. She studied him for a moment as if trying to read the truth in his eyes. You understand that this will change your life completely, right? 4 8-year-old boys don't exactly fit into the lifestyle of a workaholic CEO. Maybe that's exactly what I need, John replied, surprised by his own honesty. Yesterday morning before I walked into that bakery, I felt an emptiness I couldn't explain. Now, for the first time in years, I feel like I've found something that really matters. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. Less tense, more contemplative. Evelyn picked up her phone and began showing John some pictures of the boys. Moments from the last birthday, school competitions, beach vacations. This is Nathan receiving his award for best player, she narrated, swiping to the next photo. And here's Lucas with his first art award. Oliver won the science fair with this solar energy project, and Ethan? Well, Ethan was more interested in photographing the clouds that day, saying they looked like dinosaurs dancing. Each image was like a window into a world John never knew existed. A world that, in some way, had always been partially his. Tears unexpectedly welled up in his eyes, and for the first time in his adult life, he didn't try to hold them back. "The game is Saturday at 10 a.m., Evelyn said softly, putting her phone away. "If you really want to do this, you can start there." "But John," she paused, her eyes meeting his, "think carefully this week. Because once you enter their lives, there's no turning back." As the afternoon wore on, the empty coffee cups between them silently bore witness to the intensity of their conversation. John glanced at his watch. 3 hours had passed, but it felt like time had flown by. "I need to pick up the boys from music class," Evelyn said, gathering her things. "They have class every Tuesday and Thursday. Oliver is learning violin, Nathan and Lucas chose guitar, and Ethan, well, he surprised everyone by choosing piano." "Music?" John murmured, a nostalgic smile crossing his face. "My mom always wanted me to learn the piano, but I was too stubborn." "Looks like Ethan inherited the musical side you rejected," Evelyn teased, her tone lighter now. Then she became serious again. "John, before we say goodbye, I need you to understand one thing. The boys are my whole life. If you show up at the game on Saturday, it will be the first step of something that has no going back." John stood up, his expression resolute. "I'll be there, Evelyn. In fact, I'll cancel a meeting I had scheduled in Chicago for this weekend." "You don't have to change your life overnight," she started, but John gently interrupted her. "I do. If I'm going to be part of their lives, I have to start making the right choices from the beginning." He paused, carefully choosing his next words. "You've built something incredible on your own, Evelyn. You've raised 4 amazing boys and given them all the love in the world. I'm not here to complicate that or try to change what you've created. I just want the chance to get to know them, to maybe add something positive to their lives. And to yours too." Evelyn's eyes sparkled with held-back tears. "Hamilton School baseball field, 10 o'clock. Don't be late. Nathan always gets nervous before the games." As they said goodbye at the door of the cafe, something had shifted subtly between them. It wasn't just an agreement on how to move forward. It was the beginning of a partnership neither of them had planned, but one that seemed inevitable now. John watched Evelyn walk away, her figure fading into the afternoon crowd. As he headed back to his office, he knew his life would never be the same. The spreadsheets on his desk, the urgent reports, and the endless calls, everything felt different now, as if it had lost a bit of its significance. That night, alone in his apartment, John did something he hadn't done in years. He called his mother. For an hour, he listened to stories about his own childhood, how stubborn and determined he had been, how his smile could light up any room. Each story now held a new meaning, an echo that multiplied by 4. Before going to bed, he took one last look at the photos Evelyn had shared. 4 smiles identical to his own childhood smile shone on his phone screen. On Saturday, those smiles would come to life in front of him, and nothing in his years of corporate experience could have prepared him for that. The longest week of his life had only just begun. Saturday morning dawned clear and fresh, perfect for baseball. John arrived at the field 45 minutes ahead of the scheduled time, his heart beating so loudly it felt like it might escape his chest. Wearing jeans and a casual polo shirt, a drastic change from his usual Italian suits. He felt oddly vulnerable. The field was starting to fill with families, the air buzzing with the contagious energy of the kids. John spotted Evelyn from a distance, organizing equipment while trying to keep the 4 boys in check. Nathan and Lucas were already in their Hamilton Hawks uniforms, while Oliver and Ethan wore team shirts with their brothers' numbers. "John?" Evelyn waved, her smile a mix of relief and nervousness. "Boys, come here. I want to introduce you to someone." The 4 boys approached, curious but cautious. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. Nathan, clearly the natural leader, stepped forward, studying John with eyes identical to his. "This is John Miller," Evelyn began, her voice calm and controlled. "He's a very special friend I met recently, and he'd love to watch your game today. Do you like baseball?" Nathan asked directly, his protective posture so similar to John's as a child that it almost hurt. "Since I was a kid," John answered, keeping his voice steady despite the emotion. "Actually, I played too when I was your age." "What position?" Lucas interrupted, his eyes sparkling with interest. "Pitcher," John smiled. "Just like you, from what your mom told me." The game was an emotional roller coaster. John watched, amazed as Lucas displayed a natural talent for pitching, his concentration before each play identical to the focus John used to have. Nathan, playing as catcher, showed a natural leadership on the field that made John's chest swell with pride, a feeling that took him by surprise for its intensity. Oliver and Ethan, in the stands, kept a detailed analysis of every play, discussing stats and probabilities in a way that made John smile. They were little geniuses, each in their own way. The Hawks won 6-4, with Lucas closing out the final inning with a perfect pitch. After the game, as the family scattered, John found himself surrounded by 4 eager boys, ready to share their impressions. "Did you see my last pitch?" Lucas asked, his eyes shining. "I saw every second," John replied, fighting the lump in his throat. "It was amazing." The following weeks established a new rhythm in John's life. Board meetings started sharing space with baseball games. Financial reports were interspersed with visits to the chess club where Oliver and Ethan competed. His schedule, once dedicated solely to business, now included music recitals and science fairs. The transition wasn't easy. His assistants watched, puzzled, as the relentless CEO began leaving a little earlier some afternoons, something previously unthinkable. His phone, once dedicated only to business calls, now regularly received messages from Evelyn with photos and updates about the boys. His bond with the children developed gradually. Nathan, the most protective, kept a cautious distance, clearly worried about the intentions of this new adult in their lives. Lucas, on the other hand, had formed an instant connection with John through baseball. Oliver bombarded him with questions about business and economics, fascinated by the corporate world. And Ethan watched him with curious, thoughtful eyes, occasionally asking surprisingly deep questions about life and the universe. Then, 3 weeks after the first game, came the moment that would test all his new priorities. Mr. Miller, his assistant, entered his office on a Thursday afternoon. Meridian Corporation moved up the merger meeting to tomorrow at 3 p.m. They'll be flying in from London specifically for it. John felt his stomach sink. Tomorrow at 3 p.m. was Ethan's first piano recital at school. A recital the boy had nervously mentioned over the past 2 weeks. "Sarah, this merger represents $200 million, sir. The board has been waiting for this for months." John glanced at his phone, where a photo of the 4 boys smiled back at him. That morning, Ethan had sent a message through Evelyn's phone. "John, you're coming to see me play tomorrow, right?" "Schedule the meeting for Monday," he said finally. "But, sir, they insist it has to be tomorrow. Their CEO is flying back to London on Saturday. Then they'll have to find another partner for the merger." The words left his mouth before he could think, but as soon as he said them, John knew they were true. His world had changed. The priorities that had governed his life for the last 15 years had been reorganized the moment he saw that birthmark behind Lucas's ear. That night, as he drove home, John reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few weeks. His apartment, once a symbol of his success, now felt cold and empty. The pristine white walls practically begged for children's colorful drawings. The silence, once welcome, now seemed deafening without the sound of laughter and lively discussions. His phone rang. It was Evelyn. "John? Ethan's nervous about tomorrow. He wanted to make sure you're coming." "I wouldn't miss it for anything," he replied, his voice firm. "Tell him I'll be in the front row." The silence on the other end of the line was followed by a soft, "Thank you, John. That means a lot to him, to all of us." When he hung up, John realized he had made more than just a decision about a meeting. He had chosen a new path, one that wasn't in any boardroom agenda or financial report. And for the first time in his adult life, he was absolutely certain it was the right one. Ethan's piano performance was a turning point. As the first notes of Fur Elise filled the school auditorium, John, sitting between Evelyn and the other boys, felt something fundamentally change inside him. Little Ethan, so thoughtful and quiet, transformed at the piano, his small hands gliding over the keys with surprising confidence. "He practiced for hours," Evelyn whispered, her voice thick with pride. "He wanted it to be perfect." John watched as Nathan, Lucas, and Oliver watched their brother with complete focus, something rare for boys of their age. The bond between them was palpable, a force he was beginning to understand more and more. When Ethan finished his performance, he was met with a warm ovation, but it was the proud smiles of his brothers that made his eyes shine. News of the Meridian merger rejection quickly spread through the corporate world. The board called an emergency meeting, questioning John's decision. For the first time in his career, he found himself explaining personal choices in a professional environment. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice steady in the face of the worried expressions of the board members, "I've spent 15 years prioritizing only numbers and results. We've built a strong, respected company. But I've recently discovered that success can be measured in other ways. The silence in the room was heavy. John continued, I'm not abandoning our goals or compromising our excellence. I'm simply rebalancing priorities. Meridian Corporation wasn't our only option for expansion, and I already have 3 other proposals under consideration that won't require sacrificing important moments with my family. The word family slipped out naturally, making John realize how much his perspective had changed. The board members exchanged surprised looks. The man before them was no longer the workaholic they had known for years. The following weeks brought subtle but significant changes. John began to reorganize his office, which had once felt like an intimidating corporate fortress. A colorful drawing from Lucas took a prominent spot next to his diplomas. Photos of baseball games and chess competitions started to appear discreetly among his business awards. His assistant, Margaret, who had worked with him for a decade, was the first to notice the changes. Mr. Miller, she commented one day, I've never seen you smile as much as you have in the last few weeks. It was true. Each small achievement from the boys brought a joy that no multimillion-dollar contract ever could. Like when Oliver won the science fair with his automated irrigation project. A special collaboration between father and son, though neither of them had used those terms yet. The project had started as a simple idea during a Thursday dinner. Oliver had mentioned his interest in creating something that could help the school's community garden, where Evelyn volunteered. John, seeing an opportunity for connection, offered to help. We could use moisture sensors, he suggested, sketching a design on a napkin. And program an irrigation system that responds automatically. Oliver's eyes lit up with excitement. Like those systems you use on the farms at the company? In the weeks that followed, father and son spent hours in Evelyn's garage, working together. John discovered that Oliver had inherited his attention to detail and determination. The boy wouldn't rest until every component was working perfectly. Nathan, initially the most resistant to John's presence, began to show subtle changes in his behavior. One day, after a particularly tough game where the team lost, John found him alone on the field, practicing throws with frustration. Need some company? John asked softly. Nathan hesitated, then nodded. Over the next hour, John worked with him on his hitting technique, sharing tips he had learned in his own childhood. When they finally finished, Nathan looked at him with a different expression. Are you really going to stay? He asked abruptly. Like forever? John's heart tightened at the vulnerability in the boy's voice. Nathan, I know it's hard to trust me, but I promise I'm not going anywhere. You 4 and your mom, you're the best thing that's ever happened to me. Lucas, on the other hand, expressed his acceptance through art. His drawings, once solely focused on superheroes and baseball scenes, began to include a new character, a man in a suit, either playing with the 4 boys or sitting at the dinner table with them. One day, he shyly handed John a special drawing. It was a scene from the first game John had attended, with surprising details. Evelyn's nervous expression, the brothers' curious gazes, and John, looking both out of place and perfectly at home. It's for you to keep in your office, Lucas explained. So you won't forget the day you met us. Ethan, with his contemplative nature, often surprised John with profound observations. One Sunday afternoon, as everyone was watching a movie, he turned to John and asked, How did you know you wanted to be part of our family? The question silenced the room. John felt everyone's eyes on him, especially Evelyn's. It wasn't a decision, he answered honestly. It was like finding a part of myself I didn't know was missing. The answer seemed to satisfy Ethan, who turned his attention back to the movie. But John noticed the soft smile on Evelyn's lips and how she discreetly wiped away a tear. The changes weren't just limited to the special moments. It was in the small things of everyday life that John felt the true transformation. Like knowing exactly how each of the boys liked their sandwich at breakfast. Or recognizing by the tone of their voice when one of them was upset or anxious. Or the way his heart would warm when, distractedly, one of them would hug him as they passed by. And then there was Evelyn. The initial admiration for her strength and dedication had turned into something deeper. It was the way she led the family with a perfect blend of love and discipline. How she knew exactly what each of the boys needed at different times. How her smile could light up any room. One particularly quiet night, while the boys were asleep after a busy day at the park, John and Evelyn sat on the porch, sharing a rare moment of silence. Sometimes I still can't believe how everything has changed, she confessed. The boys, they're so different. Happier. You've built something amazing here, Evelyn, John replied, his voice soft. A real family full of love and strength. I'm just grateful to be a part of it. The amusement park wasn't the kind of place John would have imagined spending a Saturday a few months ago. Yet, here he was, holding cotton candy in one hand and Ethan's hand firmly in the other, while the other boys ran excitedly ahead with Evelyn. "Look at the roller coaster," Lucas shouted, pointing to the massive metal structure. "I'm not so sure," Nathan hesitated, his protective side emerging. "Looks dangerous." "The safety standards for these rides are rigorously tested," Oliver began his usual technical explanation, adjusting his glasses. "The probability of accidents is less than 0.001%. John couldn't help but smile. Each of the boys was so distinctly unique, yet they shared so many of his own traits. He was about to suggest starting with something more laid back when he noticed the shift in Evelyn's expression. She had paled, her eyes fixed on a distant point. Following her gaze, John saw a man approaching. Tall, athletic, with a smile that seemed overly rehearsed. "Evelyn," the man called, his voice carrying a familiarity that made John tense up instantly. "What a coincidence to run into you here." "Robert," Evelyn replied, her voice so low it was barely audible over the buzz of the park. "I didn't know you were back in town." The boys instinctively moved closer to Evelyn, with Nathan positioning himself slightly in front of his brothers. John immediately realized that this was no pleasant, casual encounter. "I've been back for a few weeks," Robert continued, his gaze shifting between Evelyn and the kids. "The boys are huge. How long has it been? 2 years?" 2.5 years, Nathan answered curtly, his defensive posture revealing a history that John didn't know about. Robert then noticed John standing there, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And you are?" "John Miller," he replied, instinctively moving closer to Evelyn and the boys. "And you must be Robert Thompson." The surname came out automatically. John remembered seeing it in a few old photos at Evelyn's house, photos that had been tucked away in a box in the attic. Robert Thompson, the ex-fiancé who had disappeared when the challenges of being a stepdad to 4 boys became more than he could handle. "I've thought a lot about you guys," Robert continued, his gaze fixed on Evelyn. "Maybe we could grab a coffee sometime, catch up?" "No," Nathan's response was immediate and firm. "We don't want to see you, Robert." John felt Ethan squeeze his hand tighter, while Lucas and Oliver moved even closer to Evelyn. The tension was palpable, years of hurt condensed into a single moment. "Nathan," Robert tried, his tone condescending, "things were complicated back then. You were too little to understand." "We were little," Lucas interrupted, his voice trembling slightly, "but we understood perfectly that you left when things got tough." Robert's face hardened for a moment before he forced another smile. "Evelyn, can we talk privately? Just 5 minutes?" Before Evelyn could respond, John stepped forward. It wasn't an aggressive or territorial move, but firm and protective. "I think the boys have made it clear how they feel, Robert. This is a family day and we'd like to keep it that way." The use of the word family didn't go unnoticed by anyone. The boys moved even closer to John, forming a tight-knit unit. Robert looked at the group, his eyes narrowing as he noticed John's protective stance and the way the children gathered around him. "Family?" Robert laughed without humor. "You don't even know these kids, Miller. I've been there since they were babies. Until you decided you didn't want to be anymore," Evelyn finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. "Please, Robert, respect our space. We've moved on." The encounter ended there, with Robert walking away after casting one last resentful look at the group. But its effects rippled through the rest of the day. The boys were quieter than usual, especially Nathan, who kept a watchful eye in every direction, as if expecting Robert to reappear at any moment. On the way home in John's car, the silence was heavy. It was Ethan who finally broke it, with his usual insight. "John won't leave like Robert, right?" The car stopped at a red light and John turned to look at the boys in the back seat. "Never," he replied, his voice full of emotion. "You're stuck with me like it or not? Even if we give you trouble?" Oliver asked softly. "Especially if you give me trouble," John smiled. "Family isn't about being perfect. It's about being together no matter what happens." Later that night, after dropping the boys off at home, John found Evelyn on the porch. She looked tired, but there was a determination in her eyes that he admired deeply. "Sorry about the ruined day," she began. "The day wasn't ruined," John interrupted gently. "It was enlightening." "How so?" "Seeing how the boys reacted, how they stuck together, it showed how much we've grown as a family over the past few months." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Evelyn, I know I have no right to ask, but, Robert, it was a long time ago," she sighed. "He came into our lives when the boys were 4. At first, everything seemed perfect. He was caring, fun, seemed genuinely interested in building a family. We got engaged after a year together. She paused, her eyes fixed on a distant point. Then reality started to weigh in. For young boys, each with their own needs and distinct personalities, it was more than he was willing to handle. One day he just left. Left a note saying he wasn't ready for that much responsibility. John felt a mix of anger and gratitude, anger at someone for hurting this incredible family, and gratitude because that abandonment in some way had paved the way for him to find his true place. The boys took a long time to trust any man after that, Evelyn continued. That's why I was so surprised by how they connected with you. It's different this time. It's different because they're mine, John replied without thinking. Then realizing what he'd said, he quickly added, I know what you mean, Evelyn smiled, reaching for his hand. And you're right. They're yours, John. They always have been. The moment was interrupted by a noise coming from inside the house, followed by several voices arguing over who had knocked something over. Evelyn laughed, wiping away a tear that had escaped. Duty calls, she smiled, standing up. Want to help solve another family crisis? There's no place I'd rather be, John replied, following her inside. That night marked a subtle but significant shift in the family dynamic. The ghost of Robert, instead of threatening what they had built, served only to strengthen their bonds. The boys, who had already been growing closer to John, now saw him in a new light, not just as the man who entered their lives, but as someone who chose to stay, even knowing all the challenges. The invitation to head the European branch of the company came on a Tuesday morning. A promotion John had dreamed of for years, a London office, an international team, a salary tripled. The kind of opportunity that, 6 months ago, he would have accepted without hesitation. It's an exceptional offer, Mr. Miller, Richard Bennett, the board chairman, commented, watching him closely from across the meeting table. Of course, it would require your immediate relocation to London. The European market doesn't wait. John looked out the window of his office, his eyes finding the park where, at that exact moment, he knew Evelyn would be watching the boys' physical education class, a routine she kept every Tuesday. He could almost visualize the scene. Nathan and Lucas competing to see who could run faster, Oliver likely calculating the speed and trajectory of something, while Ethan observed everything with his contemplative eyes. How long do I have to decide? He asked, his voice rougher than usual. Until Friday, Richard replied. The European board needs a definitive answer to begin the process. 3 days. 3 days to choose between the dream of a lifetime career and, his heart silently completed, his true life. That night, during the regular Tuesday dinner at Evelyn's house, John observed the familiar scene that had become his new normal. Oliver was excitedly explaining his latest scientific experiment, while Lucas absent-mindedly doodled on his napkin. Nathan, ever observant, noticed that something was different. You're quiet today, John, he remarked, his keen perception for behavioral changes, a trait developed after Robert's abandonment, kicking in. Just thinking about some work stuff, John tried to smile, but knew he wasn't convincing anyone. Later, after putting the boys to bed, a privilege he had gradually earned over the past few months, John found Evelyn in the kitchen. She was putting away the last of the dishes, a mundane task that somehow made him feel like his heart was being squeezed. They offered me the presidency of the European branch, he said abruptly. Evelyn's movements froze for a moment before she slowly closed the cabinet and turned to face him. London? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Yes, he confirmed, carefully watching her reaction. They need an answer by Friday. It's an amazing opportunity, Evelyn said after a moment, her voice controlled. Something you've always wanted. John took a step toward her but stopped, unsure. Yes, it was something I always wanted. Before I walked into that bakery on a Sunday morning. Before I met 4 boys who turned my world upside down. Before. He hesitated, then continued, before I fell in love with an amazing woman who showed me what truly matters in life. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. John, I can't let you give up on your dreams for us. It wouldn't be fair. But that's what you don't understand, he moved closer, taking her hands in his. My dreams have changed. That John Miller, the one who only cared about profits and acquisitions, doesn't exist anymore. Now I dream about baseball games on Saturdays, science fairs, piano recitals. I dream about noisy breakfasts and homework at night. I dream about you. A noise at the kitchen door interrupted them. The 4 boys were standing there, still in their pajamas, their expressions ranging from concern to fear. Are you leaving? Ethan asked, his voice small. John knelt down to their level. You should be sleeping, little spies. Answer, Nathan insisted, his eyes, so like John's, fixed on him. No, John replied firmly. I'm not going anywhere. But London is an incredible opportunity, Oliver remarked, ever the pragmatist. It has some of the best research centers in the world. And I could send drawings by mail, Lucas added sadly. John felt his heart tighten. Come here, he called, opening his arms. The boys didn't hesitate, rushing into a group hug that nearly knocked him over. Do you really think I'd trade this for anything in the world? But what about your job? Nathan asked against his shoulder. I can find work anywhere, John replied, meeting Evelyn's gaze over the boys' heads. But family is one of a kind. The next morning, John entered his office earlier than usual. On his desk were the reports detailing all the benefits of the position in London. Beside them was the drawing Lucas had made of him, not the successful executive but the man playing baseball with his kids. The decision, he realized, had already been made a long time ago. Richard Bennett didn't hide his surprise when John walked into his office at exactly 8 a.m. Do you have an answer? He asked, raising an eyebrow. I do, John replied, sitting down. And I also have a counter-proposal. A counter-proposal? I want to restructure our operation here. Create a work model that allows for better work-life balance, not just for me but for all employees. We have the technology, we have the resources. What was missing was the will. Richard studied him for a long moment. Does this have to do with your new family situation? It has to do with realizing that success isn't just measured by numbers on a spreadsheet, John answered. And yes, it's about my family. Because for the first time in my life, I understand what truly matters. The silence that followed was long but not uncomfortable. Finally, Richard smiled. You know, John, in 40 years of my career, I've learned that the best leaders are those who understand the value of balance. Your proposal is interesting. Develop a detailed plan and present it at the next board meeting. Leaving the office that afternoon, John drove straight to the boys' school. It was choir presentation day and Ethan had a solo. When he arrived, he found Evelyn saving a seat for him in the front row. Are you sure? She whispered when he sat down. John took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. When Ethan took the stage, his eyes found John's in the audience, and his little smile said it all. There, sitting among other proud parents, holding the hand of the woman he loved while his children, yes, his children, shone on stage, John Miller finally understood the true meaning of success. 6 months after the decision that changed everything, the house by the lake was finally ready. It wasn't a luxurious mansion like his old penthouse, but it had everything a family needed, including a customized room for each of the boys and a huge backyard where they were already planning to build a baseball field. I can't believe we're really going to live here, Lucas exclaimed, running from one room to another with his sketchbook, already planning where he'd place his artwork. Oliver had brought a tape measure and was taking meticulous notes about the dimensions of each room. My room is exactly 15.7 square meters. It's perfect for the telescope I'm getting for Christmas. He gave John a meaningful look, who pretended not to notice. Nathan, always the protector, was inspecting every detail with a critical eye. Do the windows have security locks? And what about the alarm system? Checked it twice, John reassured, placing his hand on his son's shoulder. The word son no longer felt foreign in his mind. It was a title he had proudly carried for months. Ethan, as always, observed everything with his thoughtful eyes. This house has good energy, he finally declared, making everyone smile. It's like it's been waiting for us. Evelyn was standing on the porch overlooking the lake, her eyes shining with contained tears. John quietly approached her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Are you regretting it? He asked softly. Regretting accepting your marriage proposal or agreeing to the move? She teased, leaning back into him. Both? Never, she replied, turning to face him. Sometimes it's still hard to believe. That Sunday at the bakery feels so far away now. The engagement ring sparkled on Evelyn's finger as she touched John's face. It wasn't the most expensive or extravagant ring. John had learned that true value wasn't measured in carats. It was a ring he had chosen after secretly consulting the 4 boys, who had given surprisingly specific opinions on what their mother would like. The proposal had happened during a family picnic with the boys' help. Each one had a special part in the plan. Lucas had drawn an illustrated book telling their story, Oliver calculated the exact moment of sunset for maximum dramatic effect. Nathan organized all the logistics, and Ethan composed a piano piece that made everyone cry. Mom? Lucas's voice interrupted her thoughts. Come see the drawing I made for the living room wall? Evelyn smiled, wiping away a stray tear. Duty calls? The change happened gradually in the following weeks. John had implemented his new work model at the company, allowing more flexibility and time at home. The board, initially skeptical, was impressed with the results. Happier employees were more productive, just as he had predicted. One morning, while helping the boys get ready for school, John found an old box in Nathan's room. Inside, there were photos and mementos from the time when Robert was still part of their lives. "You can throw it away," Nathan said, standing in the doorway. "We don't need it anymore." John studied his son for a moment. "Are you sure? These are parts of your story?" "Our story began in that bakery," Nathan replied with wisdom beyond his years. "The rest is just past." The wedding was an intimate celebration in the backyard of their new home. The boys, dressed in identical suits, were the groomsmen. Lucas had made all the invitations by hand. Oliver calculated the perfect arrangement of chairs to optimize the view of the lake. Ethan played the wedding march on the piano, his own version that blended the traditional melody with notes that reminded everyone of the music he composed on the day of the proposal. Nathan, surprising everyone, asked to give a speech during the reception. "When Mom told us she had met someone," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "we were scared. We'd been through this before and it hadn't worked out. But John never tried to replace anyone or change who we were. He just fit in. Like he had always been part of the family, it was just taking him a little longer to arrive. There wasn't a dry eye at the party after that. Life wasn't perfect, of course. There were arguments about unfinished homework, messy rooms, and who had to do the dishes. Lucas still occasionally had nightmares, Oliver sometimes isolated himself too much in his experiments, Nathan struggled with his need for control, and Ethan kept asking questions no one knew how to answer. But they were perfect imperfections, John thought. They were the small challenges that made each victory sweeter, each moment of joy more meaningful. 1 year after that fateful Sunday in the bakery, the Davis Miller family, the boys had insisted on keeping both last names, was complete. The lakeside house echoed with laughter, arguments, music, and occasional shouts, sounds of a real, living, imperfect, and absolutely wonderful family. On a quiet evening, after the boys had finally fallen asleep, John found Evelyn on the porch, her favorite spot for important conversations. "You know what's funny?" she commented, nestled in his arms. "For years I tried to give the boys a normal family with a mom and dad. I fought so hard for that, I almost lost sight of what really mattered." "And what was that?" "That family isn't about following a specific model. It's about love, acceptance, and choice. You didn't just accept us, you chose us. And we chose you." John thought of his former life, the lonely executive obsessed with professional success. It felt like a life lived by someone else. "Actually," he replied, "I think fate chose us. I was just smart enough not to fight it." Inside they could hear the soft sounds of the boys sleeping, Lucas murmuring about drawings in his sleep, Oliver probably dreaming about his next invention, Nathan checking one last time to make sure everyone was okay, and Ethan was probably contemplating the mysteries of the universe even in his dreams. It was a family symphony that John never grew tired of hearing. A melody that began with an impulsive decision to donate sperm years ago, grew with a chance meeting in a bakery, and culminated in the most beautiful love story, not just between a man and a woman but between a father and his children, between two lonely hearts that found completeness in each other, and between 5 souls who discovered that family is much more than blood ties. It's about choices, second chances, and recognizing that sometimes the greatest success in life isn't climbing the career ladder, but getting down to a child's level to tie their shoes, trading important meetings for baseball games, and realizing that the true legacy we leave isn't in bank accounts, but in the smiles we provoke and the lives we touch. And have you ever lived a love story that completely transformed your life? How about sharing your experience in the comments? If this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the Life Stories channel so you don't miss our next touching stories. Every like motivates us to continue sharing stories that warm the heart and make us believe in the transformative power of love. See you in the next story.